This video is brought to you by Reluctant Preppers. Click here to subscribe for free to reluctantpreppers.com.
So David, did you want to talk a little bit about your outlook for the economy going forward?
Yeah, my outlook is that there's a lot of realism coming out of what I call the Ministry of Truth. I say it tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. The mainstream media is extremely biased, and it's pretty much under control. I mean, there's a propaganda machine. So there's areas of recovery, that's probably true, but the overall economy is not really doing that well. So the idea that we're going to be able to print our way out of this or borrow enough to get out of this is not going to take hold. But that doesn't mean the economy is going to crash and burn either. What it means is that we're going to see, in my view, a steady declining lifestyle in the West. And you're going to see more and more poverty, more and more people that are not able to get jobs that pay sufficiently. So basically a decline in the overall living standards of people that live in North America, primarily in the United States.
And I know at the Liberty Mastermind Symposium, I really enjoyed your talk. And whenever we have a crisis, it seems like, and when people are suffering, it seems like the government wants to step in and save everybody. Do you see that happening this time?
I think the expectation will remain that. I mean, people have pretty much come to believe that the government can solve their problems when anything but that is the truth. In other words, the thing about freedom that most people don't recognize is it requires an extreme amount of responsibility. The idea of freedom is that you are responsible for yourself and your decisions. So if you make a bad stock pick, for an example, you have to live with the consequences because you were responsible for making it. Sure, you might have read an analyst report on it or whatever, but ultimately you were the one that made that choice. And most people don't want to accept that. They want to live in this world that we've created that is make-believe. And the make-believe world that we live in is that if something goes wrong, you have the safety net provided by the government that will come in. I mean, no better example exists than the banking system. Before this recent problem in 2008, if you go back to the Clinton administration, you had at-law situation where you had two types of banking structures. You had investment banks and you had commercial banks, and you could not swap between them. But after the Glass-Steagall Act was taken away under the Clinton administration, you could combine and any bank could do anything. Well, what happens when you're in an investment bank and you make a bad investment is that bank fails. That's what's supposed to happen in real free markets. But that's not what happened. What happened was the responsibility for failure was put on the backs of the populace. And that's what this borrowing is all about. This borrowing of money is on the populace of the United States. So they are paying for the mistakes made by investment banks, which really after Glass-Steagall was nullified as all banks. And this is a problem that they didn't create, the people didn't create, the banking system created, and the people have to pay for it.
And so getting back to how we can protect our liberties, do you see, what are some basic ways that people can take action and protect their liberties?
Well, as I said in my speech, which had a lot of really, I think, powerful points, is non-compliance. I mean, you can look at Obamacare as an example. Basically, an individual could make the choice to not comply. I mean, really, there's no crime involved. I'm not saying that's what they would say. But for a real crime to take place, there has to be some victim, and there isn't. Not paying for health insurance isn't a crime. In fact, it's illegal for them to put on the law that says that you're required to buy health insurance. That's like saying everyone's required to buy a swimming pool. And there's no difference, it's just what you're purchasing. But most people can't think, and most people won't question, and most people are scared to not comply. But this is how you make change. And you would have to take responsibility. Again, it comes to freedom. So you have the freedom of choice. The freedom of choice in Obamacare is you can have the freedom to say no, and the responsibility and face the consequences of that choice, which is what freedom is about, or you could do what you've been schooled to do, which is to comply because somebody told you to do it. But where do you draw the line? You know, are you going to jump off a cliff because someone told you to do it? It's all about obedience. It's all about submitting to authority. But you do have free will and you do have free choice. And in my speech, what I was trying to advocate is that you have to pick your own battles and be responsible for them. But non-compliance is an extremely powerful idea. And if a lot of young people decide that Obamacare is something that I shouldn't sign up for, because after all, I'll have to pay a bit of a fine, or why should I pay for something when I'm healthy when Obamacare lets you in when you're sick? Holy take, it's like getting in a car wreck without insurance and calling up an insurance agent after you have a wreck and saying, hey, I need some insurance now. It's a really good idea for me right now. I mean, this is preposterous. Only government can come up with something as preposterous as a plan that says, oh, you don't have to have it, or you can actually obtain it after you're ill, you're sick. I mean, it's crazy, but it doesn't surprise me.
And you mentioned that it seems like the majority of Americans, aren't thinking about this, aren't thinking critically about the government intervention that's happening, that our liberties are under attack. Do you see hope for this nation?
I do, because I meet people like you. See, the idea that there has to be a majority is a big fallacy. And if you go back to a speech I made at the Silver Summit 2 years ago, what I explained in there was my understanding of history, and I'm not an expert, but I've read more than most Americans, is that when Patrick Henry went into that building, that at the time about 80% of the men in that discussion were of the thinking that they were going to go along with the tax and they were going to submit to the British. And his speech, his oratory power was so strong, and thinking and ideas and ideals were so powerful that when he got done with the speech, and this is a paraphrase, because I don't know it exactly, but he said, as for you gentlemen, I do not know. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. That, not just that sentence, but the whole speech had aroused the passions of the heart so strongly that it swung the other way. Instead of being like 80% didn't want to have the revolution, 20% did, it went like 80-20 the other way, 80% said, you know what. Now that was an idea whose time had come. And I think an idea whose time has come is presently here. I think it's time for non-compliance. I think it'd be great if there was like a young people's movement that took up the Obamacare banner as an example, but it might be a good one, and said, look, I'm not sick, I'm healthy, I'm responsible for my own health. Something very simple. You aren't responsible for me, I'm responsible for me. What a concept. See, that's freedom. People think they want freedom, but they don't want freedom. A lot of people. For myself, yeah, I'll take responsibility, but I understand what it entails. But most people don't. They'd rather be taken care of. And this is like a child's attitude, that there's always going to be a parent. There's always going to be someone to take care of it. No, in the real market, and I'm talking about not in a real free market, which is a concept, we don't have that, but if you go to like a China, but you really have more of a free market, as bizarre as that may sound, because you don't have a social security system per se. You don't have a government that's going to look after you, although they've changed it somewhat. The point being is that in lesser developed nations, there aren't any systems in place to take care of you. Every day you get up, you have got to face the real world on its own terms, in its own way, and you don't have any backup plan or somebody looking after you or some social worker telling you that you're poor and you're going to get this or you're going to be given that or sign this document or whatever. And it's a harsher world in a lot of ways, but it's also a world that if it's allowed to exist and we're allowed to really work it through on our own, I believe that the free market can solve most problems. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. I don't believe in absolutely lawlessness. I don't believe in that. I believe, as the founders believed, that you have to have a high moral standard population that's highly educated in order to have a system of freedom that works for most people. Doesn't mean you can eliminate human nature or human behavior, but what it means is with a highly educated populace, you usually coincides with a high moral standard. And the system, or should I say better, the community, will take care of it. If you look at a tribal structure as an example, what you find is that they'll take care of the bad apples as they come up. And in most cases, it's an education, not a re-education. In other words, some people have to learn the hard way. I'm an example myself. For certain areas of my life, I didn't get it the first time. Nonetheless, you can't change. So I probably got off on a tangent there, but I really want to emphasize the fact that, you know, I remember sitting, you know, where you are now and talking to men that I admired at the time. Still do, of course, but like Harry Brown. And when he said government doesn't work and government is force, I didn't really, you know, get that right away. Well, wait a minute, government doesn't work, you know. And of course, now, of course, I laugh because it's so true. But I don't like thinking that government's force, but it is. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And it's very apparent now. I mean, anyone that has even a cursory look on the internet or even in the mainstream can see the militarization of the police force and the police state and the NSA and all of these things. And so there is very little freedom. And a lot of your age group have been conditioned to accept it like, well, you know, not that maybe that it's okay, or that, well, that's the way it is, and what can I do with that? And again, non-compliance, I think, is one of the safest ways to defeat it, at least at an individual level.
So to wrap up, I know, you know, you're David Morgan, the Silver Guru. Did you want to share with the viewers a little bit about how purchasing gold and silver especially is a way to protect our liberty in a way?
Yeah, selling money is important because it does protect liberty from, if you look through history. Basically, I'm for competing currencies. I'm not just a gold, silver only guy, although that's my personal choice. I think that as this evolution continues, you'll see more and more, you know, of these cryptocurrencies. Maybe some will be, you know, gold or silver backed. There's one called Ripple that I talked to the founder of that recently. It's a very interesting concept. But the free market that can never be squelched out entirely. You cannot get rid of the free market. Of course, under authoritarian rule, it's always called a black market. But I think there'll be a lot of things. But time has shown throughout history that gold and silver have been the people's choice. And that's what you want. You want the people to understand what money is, for them to vote what it is, and for that to take place on a voluntary basis. I mean, voluntary basis transactions are as purely free market as anything.
Well, David Morgan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Go to financeandliberty.com and subscribe for free for more interviews and financial insight.